Hey guys, and welcome back to this episode of Jason and His Beard. Or just ask Jason. Gosh, I can't even say the name right anymore. I have a few ads for Berean before we get started, and then we're going to move on into the Devo. First of all, there's a blood drive this Friday, December 4th, 2020, from 2 to 6 p.m. Call the office and set up a time to donate if you can. Second of all, there's a food drive all month until like the Monday or Tuesday before Christmas, because then we're going to move all the food over to the food pantry. So check out social media, Facebook or Instagram if you want more details on that, on like what we're collecting. Drop it off anytime during our office hours, 8 to 12 p.m., 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. Or you can call and set up a different time to drop off if you need to. There's a month of prayer this month. We'd love for you guys to get involved. It's not too late to participate, so go ahead and call the church office if you want to get involved in that, and we will put you on the schedule. And, of course, we have weekend services every Sunday at 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. We are social distancing, but if you don't feel comfortable with arriving in person, we'd still love for you to join us online, and we live cast that 10:30 service to Facebook Live, so you can join us in worship remotely. We also post everything on Facebook, so it's there as well. Now that we're through all the advertisements, let's get into the Devo. So the passage we're going to be talking about today, I read during my Devo yesterday. And as I read it, it reminded me of a couple things. First of all, I was never taught very much Old Testament. I knew the story, but I didn't really know what to do with it. And then second of all, that it's been a long time since I've read the Old Testament. So I was in Leviticus, and I read Leviticus chapter 10, and I'm like, this is a really weird passage. I'm sure that a lot of people, as they read it, they kind of have troubles with it because God comes off as really unnecessarily harsh. And so we kind of want to address that today. We're just going to dig into one passage. Normally I teach topically, which means I have like a topic I want to cover, and then I hit various scriptures that are related to it. Today we're going to teach what's called in some circles expositional preaching or expository preaching. I don't like the term because all preaching should be expository, but that's probably not relevant to you guys anyways. We're just going to teach on one text day. We're just going to dig into Leviticus 10, and we're going to try to figure out what all the seemingly random, weird nonsense going on there means, and we're going to try and make sense of how God behaves in this passage as well. So I'm going to go ahead and read the entire passage to you, and if you want to skip to the end, if you just want to read it on your own and not hear me drone, there's a timestamp that I'll put somewhere in this area right here. And if you go to that timestamp, then you can skip this. All right? So here's Leviticus 10. Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense. And they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Moses then said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke of when he said, 'Among those who approach me I will be proved holy, and in the sight of all people I will be honored.'" And Aaron remained silent. Moses summoned Mishael and Elzaphan, sons of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come here and carry your cousins outside of the camp in front of the sanctuary." And so they came and carried them, still in their tunics, outside the camp, as Moses ordered. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not let your hair become unkept. Do not tear your clothes, or you will die, and the Lord will be angry with the whole community. But your relatives, all the Israelites, might mourn for those the Lord has destroyed by fire. Do not leave the entrance of the tent of meeting, or you will die, because the Lord's anointing oil is on you." And so they did as Moses said. Then the Lord said to Aaron, "You and your sons are not to drink wine or any other fermented drink whenever you go to the tent of meeting, or you will die. There is a lasting ordinance for generations to come, so that you can distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And so you can teach all the Israelites all the decrees the Lord has given them through Moses." Moses and Aaron and his remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, Moses said to Aaron and his remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, "Take the grain offering left over from the food offerings and prepare without yeast and present it to the Lord and eat it beside the altar, for it is most holy. Eat it in the sanctuary area, because it is your share and your son's share of the food offerings presented to the Lord, for so I have been commanded. But you and your sons and daughters might eat the breast that was waved and the thigh that was presented. Eat them in a ceremonially clean place. They have been given to you and your children as your share of the Israelites' fellowship offerings. The thigh that was presented and the breast that has been waved must be brought with the fat portions of the food offerings, to be waved before the Lord as a wave offering. This will be the perpetual share for you and your children, just as the Lord has commanded. Later, when Moses inquired about the goat of the sin offering and found that it had been burned up entirely, he was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's remaining sons. And he said, "Why didn't you eat the sin offering in the sanctuary area? It is most holy, and it has been given to you to take away the guilt of the community by making atonement for them before the Lord. Since its blood was not taken into the holy place, you should have eaten the goat in the sanctuary area as I commanded." And Aaron replied to Moses, he's defending his sons, he says, "Today they sacrifice their sin offering and burnt offering before the Lord, but such things as this have happened to me. Would the Lord have been pleased if I had eaten the sin offering this day?" When Moses heard this, he was satisfied. Okay, so obviously that's a lot of text, and there's a few different things going on here, so we'll deal with them each individually. The first thing is Nadab and Abihu and their weird deaths. The second one is that Aaron's publicly forbidden to mourn. Third is that priests are forbidden to drink before they go to work, which is probably a good rule for everyone. Fourth is that Aaron and his sons are commanded to make certain offerings. Fifth is that they didn't eat the offerings, even though apparently they were supposed to, and Moses got pretty mad about that, but then Aaron kind of talked him down and convinced him that they didn't do anything wrong. And all this is super duper weird, and all this is super duper foreign, and we're kind of sitting here going, all right, what on earth are we supposed to do this? So let's start with the obvious one. Why did God kill Nadab and Abihu? And let's start with a slightly different question to give us context. Who were the priests? Aaron, who's mentioned in this story, and his descendants were the priests of Israel. No one else was allowed to be a priest. You had the Levites, which are kind of like helpers, like deacons. They were allowed to do some of the things that priests do, but not all of them. I use deacon in the sense of like ecclesiastical churches, like the Catholic Church do. They can perform certain rites, but not all of them, and that sort of thing. Aaron and his sons and grandsons and great-great-grandsons, that family would be the priests of Israel forever. Aaron only had 4 sons. So when Nadab and Abihu died, they only had 3 priests in the entire nation of Israel, and that's really important to remember. Now, second of all, the text says something, depending on your translation, about strange fire or unauthorized fire. And the short version of that is this. When being informed how they should make offerings to God, there's a lot of very specific rules that Yahweh gives his people, especially in concern to how meat sacrifices and grain sacrifices and incense offerings would happen. And those censers that were spoken of would be used for incense offerings. They're supposed to make a certain mix, use only fire from the altar, that sort of thing. And we don't know exactly what they did wrong, but apparently they either didn't use the right mix of incenses, or they used censers that were not blessed for use in the temple, or they used fire that wasn't from the altar of burnt offerings. There's a couple different things they could have done wrong, but the big deal is this. They're approaching the holy God of Israel, the God of the universe, in his temple, where his Shekinah glory is. Now, if you don't understand what that word Shekinah means, if you've never used it before, it's a great thing to just go ahead and look up and spend some time discussing. I'm not going to spend time on it here, but it's really significant because this is basically where God's throne on earth is. And as they approach the Shekinah, there's a lot of rules about how they should behave, because they need to understand that as human beings, they are not worthy of this, and this is a gift, and they should treat it with respect. And they don't. And based off of the later prohibition against drinking, there's a lot of people who think maybe they actually showed up drunk, and that's why they decided that, we don't really need to follow the rules because they were inebriated and making bad decisions. The short version is, regardless of what exactly they did in detail, they somehow broke their contract with God. Because all of Israel, but the priests especially, had an agreement, a covenant, a contract with Yahweh, that they would behave in certain ways and Yahweh would behave in certain ways. And these two priests broke the contract. And as representatives to God on behalf of the whole nation, when they break their contract, they're really breaking the contract for the entire nation. Kind of like our ambassadors in the U.S. to other countries have the ability to represent everyone, even people that they've never met. It's the same idea. These priests were ambassadors to God. And when they declare war or break the contract, the entire nation declares war, breaks the contract. You get the idea, right? So why was the punishment so harsh? Priests serve as mediators between God and man, and they're held to a higher standard. In fact, Leviticus has 5 whole chapters specifically about how the priests should behave, explaining special rights and rituals, responsibilities, and other things that only apply to the priests. Simply put, the leaders have harsher rules to live by. And their carelessness was a violation of the covenant with God. They were ambassadors of Israel towards God, and essentially they were declaring war because they weren't agreeing to abide by this treaty between God and Israel. Let's go through the rest of them a little bit quicker. Aaron is forbidden to mourn publicly. Normally, priests were allowed to mourn and even become ceremonially unclean by touching corpses. But mourning would have distracted from Aaron and his sons' roles as priests. And remember, there's only 3 priests in the entire nation of Israel right now. So what happens if they follow the rules we see later in Leviticus 21 and they touch the corpses and they become ceremonially unclean? That means until the right rituals have been performed and the right amount of time has passed, Israel doesn't have a priest. And that's a problem because the covenant they've made with God was just violated. Everything is falling apart around them, and they're thinking, oh no, God might abandon us. So they kind of have to do some emergency rules. Kind of like right now in the middle of COVID, we're doing some emergency rules, quarantining and shutting down certain restaurants and stuff like that. They had to do some emergency rules to make sure the nation survived what was really a crisis in their relationship between God and others. And one of those rules was, priests, you don't have time to mourn right now. We can't afford to lose you. There's only 3 of you right now. Apparently Aaron's grandsons weren't old enough, either weren't born yet or weren't old enough to become priests themselves. So Israel can't afford to allow Aaron's family to take time off for the funeral. So they're told, stay in the tent of meeting. Stay where you are. You have a job to do, and you can mourn later. That sounds really, really harsh, but think of it this way. If there's an active shooter somewhere and you hear a police chief screaming at his officers to go somewhere to do something, you hear somebody come out of an ambulance and a paramedic starts barking orders at someone, you aren't going to be mad at them, right? Because there's an emergency going on. But in a normal situation, if someone steps out of an ambulance and starts yelling at you for no reason, even though no one's in danger, you'd probably be mad about it, right? Emergencies call for different reactions, different emotions, and people can be a lot less sensitive in those situations. So we think, man, that's horrible. Aaron couldn't mourn his own children dying, but they were in the middle of an emergency. And if Aaron stepped away from his job then, the entire nation might be doomed. Next, we see that the priests are forbidden to drink, and this one's pretty easy for us because honestly, it's still a good rule. Don't drink and go to work. But Nadab and Abihu specifically probably triggered this rule. We don't know because the scriptures don't say, but it's a pretty safe assumption, a pretty reasonable assumption, I'd say, that Nadab and Abihu made bad decisions in the tent of meeting in the tabernacle because they had been drinking. And so Moses, after they died, was like, we should probably nip this one in the bud, and made a rule on behalf of God about priests not drinking before they do their priestly duties. It makes sense, okay? The fourth thing that shows up is they're commanded to make offerings. By they, I mean Aaron and his 2 surviving sons are commanded to make offerings. This was their job. Now, in this cultural context, individualism did not exist. Your rights as an individual were very low on the list of priorities in Israel. Family and community and nation were like at the top of the list. So when one individual or two individuals misbehaves, it reflects poorly on everyone. We've talked about how Nadab and Abihu were ambassadors to God on behalf of the people, and they've basically just violated this treaty that God has with the people of Israel. They violated his covenant. So now Aaron, as the chief ambassador, as it were, as the high priest, has to step in and try to salvage this covenant with God. So he's told to go make offerings, as he is supposed to do, as is commanded in God's word to his people. So he does. Now, this is all well and good, but Moses tells them to eat part of the offering, which again is in accordance with God's rules, and then Aaron and his sons don't. They actually burn the entire offering rather than keeping the piece they're supposed to and eating it as part of the ritual. And when Moses sees this, he's mad because in Moses' belief, in Israel's belief, part of the ritual that actually gives covering to the sins of Israel is that the priests are supposed to eat part of the offering. And if they don't, then Moses is sitting here like, wait, does this ritual not count because Aaron didn't eat part of it? And so he's kind of having this crisis, and he's like, guys, what on earth are you doing? Why didn't you do the whole ritual? Why did you burn the whole thing instead of eating part of it like God says you should? And Aaron's reply, I think, is actually really beautiful. He says, look at what's happened in my family today. I bear their guilt. As their father, I bear part of the guilt. Even if God is still pleased with me as an individual, there is shame on our family. So I'm not going to participate in the benefits of this ritual. I'm not going to eat something that is most holy to God because I am unworthy, because my family has made a mistake today. Now, this isn't anywhere in Scripture. He doesn't really have a biblical ground to stand on, but Aaron is someone who has walked with God for long enough and made enough mistakes along the way that he knows in this situation he should forgo that part of the ritual. He does everything else he's supposed to, but he forgoes part of it. And when Moses hears his reasoning that he's guilty because his family is guilty and it would be wrong for him to participate in the benefits of priesthood on that day because of the shame that's fallen on his family, Moses kind of looks at him and goes, oh man, I guess you're right. Aaron makes a really wise decision here. And there's a lot we can read into that, I think. But I think it's just beautiful that there's this man that knows God's will so well that he knows when the normal things don't necessarily apply. So what does this mean for us today? How does this apply to our modern lives? Well, here's a couple of lessons that I think we can pull from Leviticus 10 that still work for us today, Christians following Jesus in the 21st century. First of all, God is love. We're taught that a lot, but he is also power and justice and holiness. And if we're going to follow God, we have to accept all parts of his character and understand why those can all be true. He can be love, but he can also be justice at the same time. They don't contradict one another. Second of all, we learn that leaders are held to a higher standard. All right. I mean, here's a theoretical example. If a congregation member has a marital indiscretion, if they cheat on their spouse, then there might be church discipline. There should be a reconciliation and a counseling process if possible. But if a minister like me were to cheat on their spouse, then well, they'd lose their job and they'd probably have to find a new church. They may never serve in vocational ministry ever again. They might not only lose their current job, but lose their career. And you know what? That's a good thing, or rather a thing that is born out of necessity. It's a good process to have. The reason is, leaders are expected to be held to a higher standard, to have stricter rules. We have this idea in Western civilization that if you have position or authority or money or whatever, if you're at the top of the totem pole, so to speak, then you have less rules, that the rules don't apply to you. And that shouldn't be true in the church. It's not the way that Jesus functioned. He described the leaders in the kingdom as being those who serve all. James writes that that leaders will be held to a higher standard, that they will be judged more harshly. So leaders are held to a higher standard, whether you're Nadab and Abihu offering strange fire before God, or a minister or a deacon or an elder or a ministry team leader today. Your standards are higher than other people's, and that's a good thing. More responsibility, stricter rules. Third, part of being a follower of God is understanding that God has rules and that we need to follow them, even if we aren't a leader in the congregation. When you decided to follow God and you were baptized, you signed a contract, just like Israel did. You signed a contract with God. You agreed to live life the way that God says people should live their lives. Now, he accepts your mistakes, but it doesn't mean that you can blatantly disregard the rules, which is what Nadab and Abihu did. They just disregarded God's rules, and there are consequences when we choose to do that. Fourth, we should examine our attitudes towards corporate worship. Now, corporate worship means any setting where a group of people come together to praise God and to learn about him and stuff like that. And Nadab and Abihu, obviously, their attitude towards corporate worship was pretty flippant. They didn't view it as something they had to take super seriously. They may or may not have shown up to corporate worship drunk, and then they definitely did some things incorrectly, improperly during worship, didn't do things the way they were meant to be done. Now, our worship today isn't as strict, as stringent, as detailed as Jewish worship was, but we still should examine our attitudes. Are we like Nadab and Abihu, who kind of take it for granted, think it's not that important, treat it flippantly? Or do we take it very seriously and see corporate worship as something that is important to develop us into Christ-likeness? I really hope it's the latter, but if not, we need to start adjusting course and treating corporate worship as something that is important and something that should be respected and valued. I think that's another lesson we can draw from this. So hopefully this gave you something to think on. Hopefully it helped you understand God a little bit better and made the book of Leviticus just a little bit more approachable for you. I hope you guys have a great week. I hope you come back and join us on Sunday and join us here next Wednesday as well. Love you, and we're praying for you, and we're rooting for you. Have a nice week. Bye.